sex can be not intimate at all, or it can be very intimate. So how much connection you're feeling, I guess that varies in the situation. But basically, all that sexual play that you were having, I would count as sex. So for partners who are struggling with something, and
so would I.
Yeah.
Hi, and welcome to Rich in Relationship. And today it's all about sex. We're talking with Jessa Zimmerman, who is a sex therapist, and I'm super excited about this topic. How are you today, Jessa?
Really, Jessa, I am really good, and I'm excited about this topic too. I talk about it all day long.
Well, good. Now, everyone should be excited about sex, but that's kind of the problem, is sometimes we're not.
Right.
So how did your heart lead you to do the work that you do?
I guess the condensed version is a combination of my own failed marriage, divorce after 17 years, where sex was one of the big problems, contrasted with my happily married parents for 52 years. And all four of us kids got divorced. So having a happy couple raising us wasn't enough to equip us for success. And so I came to realize how important this is. And I really think a strong relationship, part of which is a strong sex life, provides a legacy for the future, right? The kids, the family, your ability to make an impact on the world. It's like, I'm just going to figure this out, and I'm going to help other people do it.
Got it. I got it. Yeah, I think it's got to take courage to be a sex therapist.
In what way? I'm curious about that.
Because I think there's a lot of taboo around sex, even though, in our culture, we have this very weird dynamic of this kind of Puritan thing about sex, like don't talk about it, and then at the same time, we've got this really exploitative media, which is all
right.
about sex.
Super sexualized. Yeah.
And so there's this strange tension going on of excitement and guilt and shame, they're all rolled into one. And as I mentioned to you before we started the show, there's kind of this myth that we're all going to meet our prince or princess charming and live happily ever after, which means there's going to be chemistry and it's going to be dynamic and exciting and
forever, right? Yeah. For the rest of our lives. Yeah.
And actually, even worse, sometimes people start out with really exciting and dynamic sex lives, and then it transforms into something else. So it's, the truth, the reality of relationships of all kinds is they're constantly transforming, number one.
Right.
And number two, the chemistry is constantly changing, and yet sex is something that I find I've had clients who are reluctant to talk to me about sex.
Yeah. To me, I don't think it takes me that much courage to be a sex therapist, but I think it can take a lot of courage for people to come into sex therapy as clients.
Well, I think you were either raised really well, or you you chose to move through some feelings to get into that profession. Actually, I'm just kind of curious about that.
I was actually raised in a very sex positive household, very open, sex was good. I had, mostly positive sexual experiences. So I came to this from a place of, positivity, where a lot of people come into, become a therapist to sort of overcome their own traumas or experience. They bring their struggles to their work. I guess I bring my successes to the work, but I've also had my struggles, like I was saying. So that has made it easy for me to talk about sex. And I think with clients, sometimes I'm setting a container for them to do that. So my ease around it, they can borrow that, right? It gives them permission to relax and be like, oh yeah, we can talk about this. Because I get it's really hard to come in and tell some stranger, all about what's happening in the bedroom and how bad you feel about it.
Yeah. Well, I think that your assessment of why people do what they do is dead on. I mean, I know a ton of people who do therapy because they've worked through a trauma and they want to help other people with. I'm actually a prime example. I came from a very conflicted household and had a lot of conflict in my life, and consequently the work that I do tends to be helping people work through conflict so that they can have creative conflict instead of destructive conflict. So
right.
Sense. All right, so you had very sex positive upbringing, and so you bring a really healthy frame to this. What kind of issues do people come to you with?
Well, I mean, I thought at first when I'm going to specialize in sex therapy, this is going to be so narrow, but it's incredibly diverse.
Yeah.
So, but I would say maybe this is surprising, but less than half, maybe a third of my clientele have some sort of actual sexual dysfunction, which means their body's like not working the way it used to, the way they want it to, the way it should. Most of the couples I work with, their bodies work, but their sex life isn't, so there's issues around sexual desire, what we call desire discrepancy. Somebody's way more interested in sex than the other person. They're trouble communicating about sex. Things have changed in the landscape and they need to adapt to that, but they don't quite understand that. They just think they're broken. A lot of it is just sort of understanding the nature of sex and sexual desire and the fact that we have to work on this across our lifetime together.
May we talk about both camps?
Sure.
So why don't we talk about, since you brought it up in this order, let's talk about when people are experiencing sexual dysfunction for one reason or another. And this is, I'll be transparent, this is of interest to me because I'm partnering with a physical therapist right now in helping their clients have a conversation about their needs and what's going on with them, and an open conversation, transparent conversation, because a lot of this physical therapist clients actually do feel a sense of guilt and shame, not about sex per se, but about the fact that they can't have it or are having less of it because of some physical trauma or dysfunction. So I think there's a lot of meat in that.
There is, and there's sort of two paths, when anybody's having, pain with sex or sexual dysfunction, there's sort of a medical, physical line of work to do with somebody besides me, right? With a doctor or physical therapist, and see what is possible about solving that. And sometimes this stuff is permanent and sometimes it's not. So it's like, okay, let's see what's possible to deal with the physical aspects of sexual dysfunction. And then there's the sex therapy part where I come in to really help them expand their view of what even counts as sex and what's possible, and exploring pleasure that they can share, opening up that line of communication and sort of maximizing what's possible right now. And maybe it all meets later and things start working again and, this gets easier. But if it doesn't, you can still have a really thriving sex life.
Yeah. So let's talk about what counts as sex. I'll lead into this by saying, I once took, I was in it sounds almost religious, but it wasn't. I was involved with how do I describe it? It was a leadership group. And one of the agreements within the leadership group is we weren't going to have sexual relations with each other. And my buddy and I had like a chemistry. And so we did everything except have intercourse. Well, not quite that extreme, but we were very physical with each other. There was a lot of sexuality happening. Yeah. And I remember being called out by the leadership. They said, and what the leader said is, "Are you having sex?" I said, "No, we're not."
It's like Clinton, right? I did not have sex with that woman, right?
Yeah. He didn't ask me what that meant to me. It was, and I didn't even know what it meant to him. But it was like maybe a year later, I was like, we might have been having sexual relations. I might just have had a very narrow view of that. So let's talk about that, because I think when we talk about sex, we don't really know what the parameters are.
Yeah, it's really interesting. It's an ongoing thing I mull over in my mind, is how would I define sex? Because some of the definitions are like really heteronormative. It's penis in vagina. Right. It's whatever you do that could make a baby. It's like how limiting that is. So I don't think any definition of sex has to be inclusive, no matter what kind of anatomy people have, no matter, if it's heterosexual, homosexual, whatever, the functioning of that anatomy, like it can't be dependent on what you're doing with body parts. And I also think it's really important that it's consensual, because I've had clients tell me, I lost my virginity when I was raped. And virginity is that's a whole other context, right? But that also isn't sex in my mind, because it's not about what we're doing with particular body parts. It's not about some sort of goal of orgasm. I think
what's really important about that, I'm sorry, I'm going to interrupt you, but I just want to, this is super important, is that being sexually abused does not necessarily mean that you had intercourse.
Yeah, I guess technically there could have been a penis inserted, which would meet sort of that definition, but I would not consider that sex. Sex is consensual.
Yeah, there are
Right.
all kinds of there's all kinds of abuse that goes on that has nothing to do with that.
Right. So anything that is non-consensual, I don't put in the camp. That's not sex. But sex is not dependent on particular anatomy or what you do with it.
Super fascinating. So how do you define sex?
Well, what my working definition is, it's a consensual physical expression of our innate drives for love, connection, and pleasure.
Oh, I love that. That's great.
You know, and I had somebody like questioning, I don't know if it's devil's advocate. So if I sit on the couch eating popcorn with my partner, does that count as sex? You know, physical pleasure. And it's like, well, maybe there's something about intentionality. If that's all you have access to, quadriplegic or something, and you can eat pop, I mean, I would count that as sex. If you're zoning out in front of the TV and not really connected with each other, and that's not really the place you're coming from, then I wouldn't. So anyway, I'm still working on the definition, but it's about, fundamentally, it's about pleasure and connection.
Yeah,
and sharing that
and
with
when
somebody.
you think about how sex workers approach sex, you know, a clear boundary they'll set for themselves is it's not emotional. Some sex workers won't kiss because they associate that with emotional intimacy. And so they're maintaining in their mind a clear boundary between how they're making money and when they're actually having sexual relations.
Right, right. So that would be on the pleasure end of the spectrum. Like, it's some combination of pleasure and connection, because we can certainly have, you know, sex can be not intimate at all, you know, or it can be very intimate. So how much connection you're feeling, I guess that varies in the situation. But basically, all that sexual play that you were having, I would count as sex. You know, so for partners who are struggling with something, and
so would I.
Yeah, the pervs aren't working. You know, if they don't have access to some act for whatever reason, based on anatomy or functioning, it's like there are other things, and it all counts as sex. And
sometimes in life, there are little lies we tell ourselves in order to think we're in integrity.
Right.
All right, so let's flip to the other side. So the other side is you have got two people who are consensual and love and care for each other, and for one reason or another, maybe they have differing desire, or maybe just the actual act has become less interesting to them for some reason, where once there was some chemistry. How do you approach that?
Well, a lot of it is giving them a new paradigm around this. Like, they need to understand, first of all, desire discrepancy is universal, because why would any two people want exactly the same amount of sex? Yeah. So they have to understand that that's not broken, but frequently they're falling into what I call the traps of this. So the person more interested is taking this personally and feeling rejected, and this is about them, and this is maybe,
you want me?
Right, so I'm not attractive or important or lovable, but that's
not
really,
that I've ever felt that way.
Well, think about that. That's really changes the meaning of the sex. Now we're not sharing something together. Now I need to have sex with you so that you feel okay about yourself.
So I can get something from you.
Yeah, or that you'll just be all right. You know, and it's like, oh, that's way less engaging. I can
feel attractive, so I can feel validated or whatever.
Yeah, to prove something. So I won't pout tomorrow or feel dejected or something. And so that's, of course, makes sex less and less engaging to the other person. And then the person with less desire often feels broken. Like, what's wrong with me that I don't just want sex like I used to? I don't want as much as my partner does. Often their partner also thinks they're broken. Like, something's just wrong with you. You're repressed, or your libido's dropped off, and it's your fault. And they don't understand that our libido changes and the nature of it changes.
Oh, there's so much to unpack here.
I know. Yeah, there's a lot.
Can we do another episode down the line?
Sure.
Yeah, because there's a lot here. There's so much here.
Yeah.
All right. So let's say that you have a couple that doesn't feel well sexually matched. How would you work with them? What would you suggest for them?
Well, again, it depends sort of what the issue is. If it's desire discrepancy, that's what they don't feel matched in, which is the most common thing I see. Then we've got to sort of unpack, you know, these traps and these patterns. We have to expand what counts as sex, and we really have to understand the idea that lots of people don't feel spontaneous desire for sex. But if they started and they got some touch and they're connected, and maybe their body wakes up and they get aroused and now they want sex. So we have to create way more opportunity for that. That's like the super Cliff Notes version. And there are other ways to share pleasure that don't have to have sex. It doesn't have to look the way you expect it to look. The other kind of sort of incompatibility I'll hear about sometimes is what each person finds erotic. So say somebody's kinky and somebody isn't, or somebody, I don't know, if they both want the other one to be dominant or something like that, where they have more like an erotic mismatch. That's a little trickier, because we've got to find ways that there's some sort of overlap where we can bring in both of their eroticisms. I don't even know if that's a noun, but like some way to play within that space, hopefully. Yeah, now it is.
Well, and it's interesting. I have a lot of clients, couples who are both sort of A personality types. And so that whole idea of dominance is really comes into play there.
Yeah, and they probably want to be less dominant in the bedroom, is my guess.
Yeah, well, but it's not always the same. And like on some days, one partner may want to be more dominant. On another day, another partner might want to be more dominant, or on some days, one partner might want to be, more submissive, and they sort of have to, well, they don't have to, but if they want to enjoy their time together, they're going to work out. All right, how are we going to, how does this feel today?
Yeah. And, it's sort of an exploration of, first of all, do you even know what's erotic to you? Like, what is your eroticism? And can you share that? And what's your partner's? And then is there some easy overlap to play in, which would be great. And if there isn't, is there some way to bring this in through fantasy, or can you take turns, or what, can you stretch a little bit? Like it takes, here's my Venn diagram, right? It depends how big an overlap it is. And then occasionally people are just so different in what's erotic to them that there isn't any. And then people sometimes are going to open the relationship a little bit and have some experiences with other people, or they're going to pursue their erotic interest in their own masturbation life, in their solo sex.
Yeah, well, and I guess depending on your beliefs, that can be very limiting on that. I mean, I'm thinking of clients that I have that are very strict Christians, and how that impacts their sexuality and their sex life, and what they do when they have feelings that are out of alignment with their belief system, which I believe is probably not that uncommon for any human being in any belief system.
Right.
There's a lot happening there.
Yeah.
I'm telling you, there's so much we could talk about, Jessa.
I know.
Jessa, I'm sure that what you've been talking about has intrigued my listeners as it's intriguing me. How can people find you, and sort of how do they get to know you?
Well, I would suggest they go to my not my sex therapy site so much, because I only work in Washington, but intimacywithease.com. where you can find my book and more about my online course. And especially I've got a free webinar about how to want sex again, so it never feels like a chore.
Nice.
So that's where I would start, probably.
Yeah, everyone likes a good free webinar. That's a great offer. Thank you so much. And just so I understand, what's the distinction between your sex therapy practice and Intimacy with Ease?
Well, sex therapy, I'm working directly with therapy clients, couple, via Zoom now. It's all telehealth, but I can only do that in Washington State because that's where I'm licensed, right? So that's direct client work, and of course that's very limited space. Intimacy with Ease is sort of my online course, and where people can work with me, not in a therapeutics way, but more like a coach, right? So that's where I've got those resources for people all over the world, really.
And may I ask you a professional question?
Sure.
I'm curious how you make the distinction between coaching and therapy.
Well, I don't.
Besides that, you're legally bound in Washington to only do therapy there.
Well, because I don't even do the coaching sort of one-on-one. That's all a group. It's an online course with a group office hour question and answer kind of setting. So it's very, very different than therapy.
It's less intimate.
Way less, yeah, and but it still makes the concepts available to people and gives them some place to at least start. Maybe they'll still go into therapy.
I'm going to guess it's probably more tool oriented and less emotional exploration.
Yeah, I mean, or the emotional exploration I give them in the program about delving into some of this and reflecting and journaling, they have to do on their own. And again, for a lot of people, the relationship is really good and they've needed this framework and these tools and like, what do we do to make this different? And for a lot of people, that's enough. Mm-hmm. And then others, really would benefit by seeing a therapist. So,
well, I have no doubt that there are huge swaths of the population right now wrestling with intimacy, given the changes that have gone on in the way that we live and seem to be continuing going on, even though the pandemic has been declared ended by so many people. It seems like it's not so ended, and there's still a lot of folks under stress. And I encourage my listeners to reach out. The question I ask everyone at the end of the show is, what is the legacy that you'd like to leave behind, Jessa?
I suppose there's sort of two. One, the main one is that I really think I'm helping make the world a better place, one relationship at a time, because I really think if people have a solid relationship, that is a foundation for which they can make a difference in their lives, with their children, with their families, and their jobs, whatever, right? And then I would love to think I could chip away at that thing you were talking about societally, with this taboo, Puritan, sex is bad or scary, or, if we could just realize sex is human and wonderful and it's our birthright, that would be amazing.
Yeah, well, that whole construct is crazy. Because the taboo leads to portraying sex as less than a loving act at times in the media, and like that's sort of the insanity of it. And I would love to see those things. I'd love to see a more loving perspective on sex in the media in general, so instead of objectifying it and making it something for sale.
Right, but also not idealized, right? Like it's always working when we see it everywhere, and it's like no, it takes work. So.
I've worked with a number of young men whose sex lives have been destroyed by pornography addiction, and it's because what they see in pornography is 10 levels above what might actually happen in real life for most people. And so it's like when they actually start having sexual relations, it's a downer.
Yeah.
So that idealized thing is big. All right, you've been wonderful. Thank you so much, and we're definitely going to do this again. Thank you.
Great, you're welcome.